I used to hate to go car shopping. And I used to hate to go car shopping because if I went car shopping, I knew I'd have to deal with people who sell cars. And it's not that they're bad people, but it's just that I knew that I'd be in a situation where somebody would be saying to me, so, what's it going to take me to get you in this car today? And yeah, I'm a little shy for that. And then one day I realized that that's exactly what I do for a living. Except I stand in front of groups of college students and I say, so, what's it going to take for me to get you to care about human rights today? And then inevitably, here I am this morning, here and you're there, and saying, hey, so what's it going to take me to get you to care about violence against women in the law, at least a little bit today? All right? So, you know, I assume in thinking about this and setting this up that, like my students, you're a kind-hearted lot, and that, you know, you have a great sense of fairness and justice. And so the threshold of getting you to buy into this isn't really that high. And you might make the same kind of assumption about me, except you'd be wrong. And so I begin with a confession that actually took quite a lot for me to get on board with violence against women as a matter of real great importance. Despite the fact that there's all kinds of, oh, we skipped a slide, ways that we could get into this thing. Well, one here, we'll go with this one that's here, since technology is working with us in one way or another. There are committees that have campaigns in newspapers, buses, and so forth. There are big statistics, like the World Health Organization statistic, that 1 in 3 women have experienced either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence. There are monetary statistics. So, for example, if you look at the annual cost of medical services and loss of productive output from violence against women, a decade ago you're looking somewhere around $5.8 billion a year in the U.S. economy. If you add the legal system costs, you're somewhere just north of about $12 billion a year. So maybe money could get you in the door if that's your ticket. There's you know, proclamations by presidents, by famous you know, figures. This month, right, April 2015 is National Sexual Assault Awareness and Prevention Month. Maybe that gets you in the door. It could be when people take to social media as the last place that they have to go to saying, I need help. This is my only avenue to get somebody to help me. Can you please help me? And before Facebook, maybe it was, you know, people going on a TV talk show with what they called battered women at the time, or a radio talk show. And the sad thing is that I feel bad is that none of this kind of stuff got me in the door. It took something more than that. And my story begins with a phone call. I was fresh out of graduate school. I was living in the Midwest. And my wife was a caseworker at a shelter that housed women who were victims of violence. And I knew intellectually kind of what she did, but I didn't really have a very good understanding of exactly what was the problems that she and her clients were facing every day. And I think a lot of people are like that when they interface with domestic violence as a topic for the first time. Intellectually, you understand kind of maybe what happens, but you don't understand the complexities of the power dynamics and the very specific things that are part of this issue. And that includes a lot of judges who have not had training on this. So anyway, one day, you know, the phone rings, and my wife's on the other end of the phone, and she says, can you go home a little early today, and can you let the dog out? And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Why? She said, well, there's a guy in the shelter and he's got a gun and he's looking for me and he's looking for my client because she's his girlfriend and I am the one who, quote unquote, took her away from him. And so I'm hunkered down here in this room and they've locked the place down and the police are here and they're trying to find the guy in the shelter. Even a blockhead like me starts to get it at this point that there's something really tragic and terrible and dangerous for everybody about this, and I started to pay a little bit more attention to what was going on. And I started to notice my wife going to the hospital in the middle of the night to make sure a rape kit had been administered, or driving 90 minutes to the nearest big hospital to see her clients who've been abused, some of who passed away during those visits. And I would meet the women at the shelter at public social functions, fundraisers and things, and hear their stories and interface with them. And it became real for me in a way that it had not been before. I'd spent a decade studying torture in other countries, not realizing the extent of torture happening in every street, in every town, every day, in my own place of residence. But even a blockhead like me needed more. And so one day she came home, and she was really angry. She was at a a full order of protection hearing as a victim's advocate, and she was angry at the judge. And I said, well, what went wrong? What happened? And she said, well, this abuser is a really pretty bad character, and we had asked the judge to hold him for 10 or 15 minutes until my client and I got off the premises safely before he was released. And she said no. I said, what do you mean the judge said no? She said, well, she said no. I said, well, that's just indecent. That's uncivil. Like, what do you mean? Why wouldn't you do that? That makes so much sense. And I said, well, isn't there some sort of law that the judge has to do this? And she said, no, there's no law. And she's right. What she was asking for is something called staggered departure. And it's something used in adversarial court settings to let people get off premises safely. Some judges don't like it because victims advocates like to meet with their client typically for a little bit after their hearing, and that's going to tie up their bailiff for like a half an hour, you know, for that meeting, and then for the extra 15 minutes to get off the premises. And states don't have laws that require judges to do this. Some states like North Carolina or Oregon have best practices to encourage judges to do this, but in the state that we're in, there wasn't even a statewide best practice. There was a district or two that encouraged their judges to do this, but it was up to each judge. And so I started to wonder, what is it like? What are laws about violence against women really like? And I started to get interested in this as a political scientist. And you know, my mind went immediately to the international because that's my training. And I was looking for information about laws. And I would find statistics like this from the UN saying 2/3 of all countries have outlawed domestic violence. Okay, well, my first question is, who are the 1/3 that didn't? Right? But the other question I thought was like, well, I don't think about law in a yes or no way. Like, you've got a law or you don't, which is what they're dealing with here. I don't accept that any more than I accept the restaurant menu that says soup or no soup, or sandwich or no sandwich. And I really like soup and sandwich. This is important to me, And I don't like this either. To me, laws are strong, they're weak, they're fair, they're unfair. They promote equality, they don't promote equality. So what's the more detailed picture of this? And I recruited a student of mine at the time, Jill Haglund, who's the co-author of my book, and we decided that we were going to try to do something a little better than yes or no. And so we looked at 4 types of violence against women: rape, marital rape, sexual harassment, and domestic violence in 196 countries. We looked at the laws in these countries about the prohibitions on these kinds of violence. And we tried to do something a little more fine-tuned than yes or no. We would call laws non-existent or discriminatory, incomplete or weak, correlative, which I'll explain, and laws for which there's full protections. The importance between, the difference between a 2 and a 3 is great. So for example, domestic violence. A country with a full legal protection would have an actual domestic violence statute on the books. A country with a court of law would say, well, we don't have a domestic violence law, but there are assault and battery laws on the books, and women who've been beat up can just use those. And we attempt to do better and divide out, say, 2 and 3 and this 4-point scheme instead of the yes or no thing, because we really believe in our hearts that humanity is in the details of things like this. So, for example, if you're a country that gets a 3, you have an actual explicit law that names violence against women, you are saying to your citizens that women are a specific group at risk, and violence against women is a specific type of violence requiring a specific solution. Where if you have a correlative law that say, hey, you can just go use assault and battery laws, you're saying that women are not a specific group at risk, and violence against women is not a specific type of violence requiring specific solutions. And I believe that law is at its best when it's luminescent, not reflective, and it's pointing ways for us to be better. And protecting women against violence through law is a way for us to be better. So let me tell you what the world looks like a little bit in terms of what these laws are out there. Well, we're going to do 4 types of violence: rape, sexual harassment, domestic violence, and marital rape. In our 0 to 3 scale, 3 is happy, 0 is bad, right? So it's easy to figure out where we are. So rape is the most protected legal, has the most legal protections, followed by domestic violence, sexual harassment, and marital rape. So the greatest legal protections internationally for rape and the least for marital rape. And in the book we get into a little bit about why this is the case. But we could look geographically as well. Like on these maps, green's going to be good, red's going to be bad. Here's rape laws. Right? Most countries have a full legal protection against rape. Now, does a full legal protection mean perfection? Absolutely not. You see United States is green on this map. We do have full legal protections against rape. Could the United States do a lot better, for example, in enforcing orders of protection, making police enforce orders of protection? Absolutely. Could we do better for people who've been impregnated through rape and decided to carry the baby to term and have to defend themselves against the perpetrator intruding in their lives again through child custody once and visitation? Sure, we could do better, but we do have full legal protection, and that's kind of what green means. Marital rape is a different story, and this map looks like this. And these maps don't give us answers. These maps point us to questions. Why are these countries red? Why do these countries have no laws about marital rape while some other countries do? Why this variation? Why do they maybe have discriminatory laws or something like that? Why is it so different from rape? Why do countries that have rape laws not have marital rape laws? These maps point us to these questions. Domestic violence looks a little different. Here we see a lot more orange. We see a lot of laws that are created so that they're not easily enforceable. For example, a lot of domestic violence laws internationally place a disproportionate burden of proof on the victim rather than the perpetrator. Women have to go so very far to prove their case. Sexual harassment laws. See, very similar, a lot of orange, a lot of incomplete laws. A lot of countries will outlaw sexual harassment in their own shop, but not in the private enterprise workplace. So how big a deal really is it, one type of law versus another, right? Is this an academic distinction? Is there something really important going on here? Well, let's look again at the difference between the 2 and the 3, something that is really, you could call the normative gap. 2, there's some laws, and 3, there's full normative expression of support for the women who are the victims of this kind of thing. So the difference in practices is those countries who get a 3 as opposed to those countries who get a 2, those countries with explicit laws rather than just kind of here's some laws you can use, they have lower fertility rates. They have fewer women among those in the population living with HIV/AIDS. They have better enforcement of their gender violence laws. They have higher scores on the UN Gender Development Index, and they have higher scores on the UN Gender Empowerment Measure, the old measure. So there is really a practical difference in this little tiny difference in law. Do we have an explicit law, or do we just have some other kind of laws that people can use? Why are things this way? Well, one explanation about why there's some laws about women and why there's not is that, laws are made for men because men exist in the public sector, and things that happen to women, they happen in the private sphere of life. And we don't make laws about the private sphere of life. Well, I don't like public-private any more than I like, law or no law or soup, no soup. There's things that are more private and more public, and some things have a dual characteristic. So I like to think of private-public as a sliding scale, as a continuum. So what would we expect to see? Well, in practice, if this theory was right, we'd expect to see that those laws about the most private forms of violence against women would be the last laws you'd get. And the first laws you'd get would be those types of violence against women that are the most public. So we hypothesized our 4 different forms of violence against women, with marital rape being the most private and sexual harassment being the most public. It's an arguable list, but we thought it was reasonable with which to start the conversation. What did we find out was the case in practice? Because we were able to determine a sequence of the way that governments grant these types of laws. Well, indeed, marital rape, the most private type, would be the last type of law you'd get, but followed by sexual harassment, which was not the first type, but the next to last, followed by domestic violence and rape. So it's not necessarily just the private-public character of these crimes that determines what laws you get regarding them. We found out that women legislate for women. Those countries that had a greater share of women in their legislatures produced better laws and more laws protecting women against violence. And this is well understood in American politics, but it's been a point of contention in international views about women. International law. Those countries that are party to CEDAW and who haven't reserved the heart out of the thing do better. They pass better laws about gender violence. And part of this is because the longer states are party to CEDAW, the more social mobilization around women's issues has happened in those countries. We found out that tradition and custom degrades the ability to make strong laws protecting women against violence. One example of this is dual legal systems, where you have a formal legal system and an informal legal system that live together simultaneously. And also certain traditional and religious practices degrade that. You may ask yourself how much you're worth. Humanity requires us to ask the question about how much we are worth. And the great thing about human rights is that we can answer this question that we're worth as much as we decide we are. Right? And to the extent that we decide women are worth as much as everyone else, that is, that women are as human as everyone else, through the creation of laws to protect them from constant, senseless, gender-based violence, we have a better type of humanity. Thank you.